Many thanks for joining us today for this Cambridge University Press webinar on the Cambridge history of the Kurds, which we published in April 2021, and which is a landmark new addition to our long-standing Cambridge Histories programme of authoritative works of scholarly reference. My name is Michael Watson, Head of History Publishing at Cambridge University Press. I'm very pleased to introduce today's panel, which is made up of three of the volume's editors, Hamit Bozarslan, Cengiz Gunes and Veli Yadirgi, as well as three of the contributors to the volume in Djene R Bajalan, Isabel Käser, and Choman Hardi. Djene R Bajalan is assistant professor in the Department of History at Missouri State University. He's previously taught and studied in the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Iraqi Kurdistan, and his publications include, as co-editor, Studies in Kurdish History, Empire, Ethnic, and Islam, which was published in 2015. Hamit Bozarslan is Director of Studies at the EHESS in Paris. He's the author of a series of books on the Kurdish issue and Middle Eastern politics more generally, including, most recently, L'Antidémocratie au XXIe siècle, Iran, Russia, Turkey. Cengiz Gunes is Associate Lecturer and Honorary Associate in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Open University. He's the author of The Kurdish National Movement in Turkey, which was published in 2015, and has published widely on different aspects of Kurdish politics across the Middle East. Choman Hardi is Associate Professor in the Department of English in the American University of Iraq, Sulaimani, and Director of the Center for Gender and Development Studies there. Her publications include Gendered Experiences of Genocide, which is published in 2011, as well as collections of poetry in both Kurdish and English, including the Forward Prize shortlisted Considering the Woman. Isabel Käser is postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern and a visiting fellow at the LSE Middle East Center. Her book, The Kurdish Women's Freedom Movement, Gender, Body Politics and Militant Femininities, has just recently been published by the press. And finally, Veli Yadirgi is a lecturer in international political economy at the University of East London, having previously taught at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. He is the author of the double award-winning book, The Political Economy of the Kurds of Turkey, From the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, which was again published by the press back in 2017. Now, I'm going to hand over to Veli, who will be moderating today's webinar. Thanks, Veli.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in the webinar. I would like to begin by relaying our sincere appreciation to Michael, to Amy, and to the other excellent Cambridge University Press personnel in the US and in the UK for the time and effort they've put into organising this excellent and exciting webinar. I'm not going to abuse my position as the moderator by talking for too long, as I want to have ample time for the question and answer session at the end, which we're all very much looking forward to. So I'll keep my introduction to the session very, very brief. The Cambridge history of the Kurds is the end product of the collective labour of 39 contributors over 3 years. Unquestionably, it was an extensive and incredible journey. We're very grateful to all of our colleagues who partook in this magnificent odyssey, as a result of which we've been able to produce this edited volume, which we hope will enhance the knowledge on the Kurds and on Kurdistan. Would be most ungracious if we were to omit expressing our gratitude to the Cambridge team for their instrumental guidance, editing, time and labour. So we're very thankful for bearing with us and for being on this long journey for 3 years. In the past decade or so, the Kurdish question has re-established itself at the heart of the regional political debates at a time when, sadly, the Middle East is once again engulfed in conflict and violence. This volume examines the Kurdish question as a deep-rooted, multifaceted, complex transnational issue. It brings together chapters and analyzes the Kurds and Kurdistan from the medieval period to the present, and takes a broad multidisciplinary approach to events in the Kurdish domains in the Middle East. The multidisciplinary approach enables us to delineate and elaborate on the complexities of the social, political, economic, and cultural forces and features pertaining to the Kurds and Kurdistan, as well as enabling us to examine these forces and features from a number of innovative and critical perspectives. As promised, I'll be very terse. I'll stop here and will now pass the virtual mic to fellow co-editors and contributors so that they could further elaborate the forces, features, perspectives, as well as approaches that I've only, alas, very tersely touched upon. We will begin with Professor Hamit Bozarslan, and then we will hear from Dr. Cengiz Gunes. He will be followed by Dr. Choman Hardi. After Dr. Hardi, we'll hear from Isabel Käser, and finally, we'll hear from Dr. Djene R Bajalan. After Dr. Bajalan will receive your questions, please put these questions in either the chat room or the Q&A box, and please kindly state who they are for. So, each speaker would have 5 minutes. We'll begin, as mentioned, with Professor Bozaslan, who will straight the book in the wider fields of Kurdish studies and Middle Eastern studies. Professor Bozaslan, please.
Thank you so much, dear Veli. It is my pleasure to be here today. And actually, I have to first thank so much Veli and Cengiz, because I think that they were much more useful in this process, and they were the main architects of this process. So without them, I think that nothing good could happen. And of course, I will also thank so much the wonderful team that has accepted to work on this project. The Cambridge History of the Kurds is not the only collective book of the Kurds. We have a couple of other ones. And recently, maybe you will not believe me, Gazprom from Russia has published a quite surrealistic book on the Kurds, a collective book. But I think that what is very different for us, or concerning our book, is of course the prestige of the Cambridge University Press. And thank you so much for all these colleagues, fellows that have followed the process of production of this book. But it is also a product of a maturity. 25, 30 years ago, in the main three languages, German, English, and French, in Europe, there were hardly 25, 30 books. Today, sometimes in one or two, we have one or two books in English alone on the Kurds. And what is also important is that 25, 30 years ago, all of the expert scholars who were working on the Kurdish issue, the Kurdish question, while today we have a much broader scope. We work on the Kurdish history, on the medieval history, on the modern history, on the plural Kurdish societies, because there is not only one Kurdish society, a transnational but still divided society, the gender issue, the minorities. So I think that we have a much broader perspective today. And this much broader perspective does not mean that we only analyze the Middle East from its margins. Of course, Kurdistan may be considered as the margin of one of the margins of the Middle East, but at the same time, being interested in the margins means also that you redefine what has been called, what has been defined very often as the center of the Middle East. It means Turkey, Arab world, the Arab world, and Iran. In this book, I think that we have quite important elements on Kurdistan, before everything, as an inter-imperial space. Inter-imperial space means, before everything, a space between the Mongol Empire and the Mamluk Empire, and we know how much the Kurdish issue has determined the evolution, at least of the Mamluk Empire first. And thereafter, we have, of course, the Safavid Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And just to tell you that in the Ottoman Empire, after Mehmed II, the Turkish tribes have been dismantled, while the Kurdish tribes have been preserved, and the Kurdish derogatory entities have been recognized. And in the 19th century, we have clearly an inter-imperial space between Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Persia. And I think that this situation of inter-imperial situation has not been definitely buried in the 20th century. In the 20th century, Kurdistan has been a space of violence, contest, repression, war too, but at the same time, it has also been a space, multicultural space between the Russian, Persian, Turkish, and Arabic cultural areas. And it is simply impossible to understand the evolution of Turkey of 1920s or 1930s without taking into consideration the Kurdish issue itself. The formation of Kemalism in the 1930s as one of the three pillars of an anti-democratic world, as the Kemalist doctriners has explained it, is directly linked, among other things, to the Kurdish issue. I think that one cannot understand how Turkey has evolved in the 1990s without taking into consideration the Kurdish issue. The Iraqi 58-68 decade has been mortgaged entirely by the Kurdish issue. Without this issue, it will be simply impossible to understand why so many military coups took place and why the liberal phase of some Iraqi intellectuals and politicians has been buried. In Iran, you have a similar situation, and today the Rojava, what we call Rojava, has become basically the heart of the Syrian conflict, while at the beginning, the Syrian revolution had no direct link with the Kurdish issue. So I think that there is a centrality of the Kurdish issue and in the Middle East, and this centrality allows us also to redefine what the empires were and what the states are today. Of course, there are many other issues that we could have dealt with. For instance, the urban history, the municipality. We don't have anything on the municipal histories in Kurdistan. The tribal transformations during the 20 last centuries. The minorized groups, including the Roman groups of Kurdistan, the issue of generations. But I think that when we talk about the issue of generations, it means also that the new generations of of scholars, both in Kurdistan or from the other communities among European or American scholars or Latin American or Chinese or Japanese scholars, will take over what we have done and contribute with other volumes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bozaslan. You played a pivotal role. Without your guidance, I don't think we would have been here. Thank you for bearing with us and for your detailed feedback on each and every chapter. Both me and Cengiz have learnt quite a lot, so thank you. Now we will hear Dr. Cengiz Gunes, who is one of the co-editors. He will touch up on the composition and the content of the book. In other words, he'll give more information about the composition of the edited volume. Professor Dr. Ganesh, please.
Thank you, Veli, and thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon and good morning if you're joining from America. I'm going to talk about the content of the book, as Veli mentioned. The title makes it very clear that it's a history book, but it also covers the contemporary period. So it's more than a history book. And our contributors are internationally renowned scholars, most of whom have published extensively, but we also have new scholars who are, we believe, making an important contribution. So we're very happy to have a broad range of scholars in the book. Our contributors work within different social science and humanities disciplines, but sort of the key focus of all of their work is of the research is on the Kurds. So different disciplines, but the focus is on the Kurds. In total, we have 36 chapters in the volume, plus quite a long introduction. And the chapters are organized within 7 parts, and I will briefly talk about each of these parts. Part 1 covers the period from the 15th century until the early 20th century and discusses the main historical developments that took place in Kurdistan in that time frame. It covers the rise and fall of the emirates, the challenges that the Kurdish emirates faced in their struggle to exist in a region that was increasingly dominated by 2 very strong central powers, the Ottoman and the Persian empires. The socio-political consequences of the fall of Kurdish emirates, and also the emergence of Kurdish nationalism as a modern ideology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which Djene has authored. And we also look at the role of Islam, the role Islam has played in the early articulations of Kurdish nationalism in the period. And finally, Veli's chapter on the economic changes in Kurdistan in the period. Part 2 examines the impacts of regional political developments on Kurdish society and politics in the 20th and 21st centuries. And each chapter in part 2 traces the developments in Kurdish regions of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria during a specific period. So each chapter examines key political developments across Kurdistan and interprets them in light of regional and international developments. Part 3 also covers the same period, the 20th and 21st centuries, but each chapter has a state level focus, and overall collectively, the chapters in that part highlight the main changes and key developments and transformations that took place in Kurdish politics in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. And we also have a chapter on the Soviet Union as well, Kurdish experience in Soviet Union. Part 4 looks at religion and society, and it begins with 2 chapters about Islam. One looks at the role of Islam in Kurdish society, sort of generally speaking. And the second one looks at the rise of political Islam in Kurdish politics in Turkey. We also cover the positions of religious minorities and sort of Alevis, Yazidis, and Yarsan communities in Kurdistan. And also we look at the evolution, another chapter that looks at the evolution of Alevis, more specifically in Turkey during the 20th century. And we end that section with a chapter on the changing role of tribes and tribal affiliations in Kurdish politics and society during the 20th century. Part 5 looks at or examines the history and provides an account of the evolution of the main varieties of Kurdish language. And we have chapters on Kurmanji Kurdish, one in Sorani Kurdish, and one in Kurmanjki, which is also known as the Zazaki language. And part 6 looks at the developments in the fields of art, culture, and literature. And our contributors provide an account of emergence and development of Kurdish literature, Kurdish poetry, Kurdish theater, and Kurdish cinema. And part 6 ends with a chapter that examines the main artistic and cultural developments and productions that took place across Kurdish regions in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria in the past 3 decades. And our final part 7, looks at the examines the transversal dynamics associated with Kurdish politics and society. So this part looks at the more recent developments, covers the internal struggles within the Kurdish society, and we cover a range of topics, including the inter-Kurdish ideological debate and contestation, the emergence of indigeneity discourse and claims within Kurdish transnational movement. We look at the formation of Kurdish diaspora in Europe and its impact on Kurdish politics and society. And we have two chapters that looks at the role of women and women's political movement. And one of them by Dr. Choman Hardi looks at women's participation and influence in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And the second one by Dr. Isabel Käser looks at the Kurdish political mobilization in Turkey, but tries to bring in the developments that are taking place in Syria as well. And there was supposed to be another chapter.
Cengiz, please
wind
up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to do that. Thank you. There was supposed to be another chapter on Kurdish political representation of Kurdish women in Turkey, but for various reasons, the author was not able to submit, and we couldn't find a replacement without delaying the publication of the book. And as Professor Bozarslan has highlighted, if we were doing the book now, we would probably be able to include some other chapters on other important issues, such as as Professor Bozarslan mentioned, the Roma community or the Christian communities in Kurdistan, and perhaps also the Armenian-Kurdish relations in the historical context. And just to conclude, the book is, as Veli mentioned, is a multidisciplinary book, and it's kind of broadly reflective of the Kurdish studies as a whole, as a discipline. And hopefully it will contribute to the interdisciplinary debates, and also it will intervene in the politics and history of the Middle East more broadly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ganesh. Now we will have Dr. Choman Hardi and Dr. Isabel Käser. Both will be speaking about the linkages between gender studies, Kurdish studies, and the edited volume, as well as their chapters. We will begin with Dr. Hardi. Please, Choman, if you could begin.
Thank you, and good evening or good morning, everyone. As Veli mentioned, I'm going to talk about the intersection of gender studies with Kurdish studies. We know that for decades, the focus was on ethnic oppression. This overarched all other issues in Kurdistan. This was reflected in their internal debates about justice, but also in the academic debates about the Kurds. And women generally, as members of different social classes or contexts, were largely ignored in the academic research and debates. This is partly obviously because ethnic oppression and resistance were very much gendered, at least in Iraqi Kurdistan. The majority of the people who were victimized by the state and murdered were men, and the majority of the resistance, fighting resistance, were women, so were also men. So basically, women and men had different roles and treatments, and the mainstream Kurdish studies discourse focused on men's experiences as victims of violence, but also as agents of change and protectors of the nation. In my book about Anfal, I mentioned how, for example, measuring Anfal by destruction and aggregate mortality figures and the destruction of the Kurdish revolution has produced a sort of impoverished and gender-blind version of the Anfal, which sort of does not give us the full picture of what went on in this particular case, for example. So research in Kurdish women began as early as 1980s. People like Shahrazadi Mujab started writing about Kurdish women. We know that using gender as an analytical tool sort of started with the development of feminist theory in the 1970s. Since then, making women visible and highlighting their hidden experiences and giving voice has been a focus, which sort of changed many disciplines, including Kurdish studies. But we can say that safely that this field, the women's studies within Kurdish studies, has really flourished in the 2000s. And this may be a reflection of change in material circumstances, for example, funding opportunities for research, publication opportunities, but also fieldwork opportunities. The establishment of the Kurdistan regional government and the Syrian uprising opened up the space for research. Like many other fields, there are problems of representation, concerns about who speaks and who's silent, who represents who and how and for what ends, have been long discussed. They are not new questions. But I just want to highlight in particular in the case of Kurdish studies, in particular in relation to women, this is salient mostly in the case of researchers who do not speak the language of the community and therefore cannot follow the discussions in the community's language. Sometimes base large-scale generalizations on small samples and short-term engagements, fieldwork. Sometimes are not clear about methodology, how the sample was selected, why, problems of access or lack of it, and sometimes using extractive approaches. What I mean by that is at times researchers come to the region for brief periods, not speaking the language, not engaging with the community in a long-term fashion or meaningful way, and passing verdicts about what's going on. The research is largely shaped by the researcher's interests rather than the community's interests. It does not result in outcomes that meet the community's needs, and it sometimes creates reductionist and sensationalist representations of Kurdish women, simplifying complex stories and pictures. I wanted to highlight a couple of examples from my own experience with researchers. A colleague of mine had done a research on Kurdistan regional government, and in the initial report which he shared with me, he quoted an independent journalist saying, the Kurdish regional government is still an infant. Now, anyone who lives in Bashur knows that this is the discourse of the Kurdistan regional government, and this journalist was obviously associated with one of the political parties and was not an independent. So question is, who are the researchers' guides? Who are the gatekeepers? Who are the translators? Does he or she know that she might be walking into a minefield? There are other mistakes about one's own prejudice, collecting samples that confirm one's preconceptions that all Kurdish women are oppressed, all Kurdish men are oppressors, Kurdish women do not have the means of resistance, they have no agency, and the only way to resist is by adopting modern aka Western standards. I just want to quote Abu Lught, who says, what do we do when after liberation, for example, the women in Afghanistan do not want to remove their burqa? They want different things from what we want from them. What's our stand on that? Do we want them to do what we want, or do we genuinely accept difference because women are products of their own social environments? Salam al-Mahadin talks about how Arab women are reduced to two images in the media. One of them in the sort of global north media, they are sort of hijabi, oppressed women, burqa clad. And the other one is in Arab satellite media, which is very much sexually provocative, dancing and wearing revealing clothes and skimpy clothes. These are both extreme representations that don't have much, they don't bear reality with don't bear a similarity to women's real experiences on the ground. Similarly, in Kurdish studies, women's studies, we have now two images that are very prominent: the voiceless and powerless victim, hopeless victim, and now the empowered woman fighter. And while these are two examples of the extreme ends of the spectrum, the majority of the women are in between these two, and many of these multidimensional complex realities are simplified and ignored. So this is the context of my paper, and I think it's very important that a book like this one gives platform to women's representation because of the bias initially or in Kurdish studies in relation to women's issues. This woman studied in Kurdistan region of Iraq that I have written about has basically two accusations launched against it. One of them is by the insiders who believe that these NGOs are westernized women who are trying to corrupt good women who know their place in society. And there's the external accusation by some academics and some diaspora feminists who the debate about NGOization and how they call these program-based organizations that are funded and backed and guided by the establishment, by political parties, by neoliberalism and colonialist powers. Therefore, they cannot really produce genuine feminist activism. Some even call, to quote one article, call this women's organizations the Trojan horse of neoliberalism in the region. I just want to finish by saying this Kurdish political establishment is actually a transnational political entity because of globalization and wars with international engagement and the Kurdish diaspora. And we also know that neoliberalism, colonialism, capitalism are all international orders. Any funding received, not just in KRG, but also outside in universities in the global north, are part of the neoliberal order. There is very little space left for independent funding from that. So if knowledge production and if problems of representation exist in KRG, they also exist elsewhere. Being an independent feminist does not mean that you leave institutions alone. People on the ground here, women on the ground, actually have to deal with the institutions, whether they want to change laws, make sure the laws are implemented, whether they want to change the media discourse. And sometimes being radical and saying these NGOs, because they are funded by international agencies and colonial powers, are not doing good feminist work. Sometimes being radical amounts to not doing anything. At the end of the day, you want to change things on the ground while also working for systemic change and trying to change the status quo. And thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, Dr. Hardi. Now we will pass the virtual mic to Dr. Käser.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you, Veli, and thanks to the editors and the press for inviting me here today. So much effort and labor went into this volume, and it's really great to celebrate it here today. I'm the author of chapter number 36, the very last chapter in this hefty volume, titled A Struggle in a Struggle, The History of the Kurdish Women's Freedom Movement, 1978 to 2019. So this work was part of my larger PhD project, which I undertook at SOAS between 2014 and 2018, just to give you an idea of the time in which my data was generated. My explorations overall, and particularly in this chapter, were inspired by the question of how women got to play such central roles within the PKK and its different armed and political branches. From women fighters to politicians and activists. Because as we saw with the start of the Rojava Revolution in 2012, women were at the forefront, both militarily, but also politically everywhere the PKK was active. But how did they get there? What is the history of the different spaces of activism? Because clearly for the women to today stand so prominently at the boundaries between us versus them, between the liberated Rojava and the yet to be liberated rest, a lot of work, a lot of struggle had been done by those who came before them. Now, it's important to mention that there are a lot of different Kurdish women's movements. The one I refer to here is the one linked to the PKK, but every part of Kurdistan historically had women active in different fights for different versions of Kurdish liberation, something I touch on in this chapter, and that also Choman, of course, spoke about this. Now, before I zoom into some of my arguments, I want to give the chapter some more context. 2014, when I started this research, was also the time when the Rojava Revolution started gaining international attention with the defense of Kobani and Jenga. As a result, we saw a surge of publications written by journalists, activists, and academics close to the movement, which told the important but somewhat idealizing story of the revolution, while the movement's own discourse centered an essentialist free woman who is at the heart of the revolutionary project. At the same time, Western media was reproducing Orientalist stereotypes of the one exceptional women's militia fighting in an otherwise barbaric Middle East. Surely things were a bit more complicated, I thought, as I set out on this journey. So on the one hand, there wasn't much scholarly research available on this particular Kurdish women's movement. And on the other hand, I was confronted with a body of scholarship that showed how nationalist movements are not necessarily conducive for women's emancipation because they attribute essentialist qualities to women and men of the aspire new nation. They require a following of a charismatic leader, and in one form or another, an adherence to revolutionary chastity linked to ideas of women's honor and purity. Moreover, much of the literature in feminist international relations argued that women who participate in armed struggles are often pawns in a male game, patriarchal structures are further entrenched by war and conflict, and women are pushed back into the private sphere post-conflict. All of which led me to the question whether this movement, because women are organized separately and their struggle is not linked to a fight for a new nation state, but for a democratic confederation, might this mean that this movement and its gains in terms of new gender norms and relations will be more sustainable than seen historically and cross-culturally with other movements? To explore this question in this chapter, I look at how the women within this movement fought for space and filled those spaces with particular claim making and political organizing, and how this is organized between the mountains and the cities, resisting different attacks against its ranks. My explorations into the interplay between national liberation, feminist mobilizations, and new body politic took me from Diyarbakir to Istanbul, from Rojava to Erbil, and from Mahmur to the guerrilla mountain camps. Here I spoke to young recruits and old commanders, martyr mothers, and political activists to understand how this movement and its knowledge production is organized transnationally. In this chapter, I center the accounts of the women who have been active in the movement since the 1980s and how they experienced the early years. It became clear that they not only had to fight against their external enemies, such as the Turkish army, but also their comrades who considered them to be lesser revolutionaries because of their gender. We had to fight in order to be able to fight, I was told by one of the commanders. I found that different from previous nationalisms in the region, women in the PKK and its sister parties no longer represent the home or the honor that needs protecting from men, and neither are they expected to stay at home to reproduce the nation. Women are instead expected to get out of the house and actively participate in defending the honor of the homeland, either through a political or armed struggle. My work shows that wherever the party holds power, women become the markers of freedom. They demarcate the boundaries between us, a gender-equal society based on radical democracy, and them, the barbaric other, Daesh, the Turkish and Syrian regimes, and the racist and capitalist world order. Importantly, this is a desexualized, non-state nationalism where the nation needs to be liberated first before equal and free relationships can be had. Clearly, with the Kurdish women's freedom movement, it's never a clear either-or case, black and white, and I try to stay away from these simplified free, unfree, and reactionary or revolutionary binaries, and instead show how this movement complicates and confirms and reinvents and reproduces certain theories and tropes on war, gender, sexuality, and nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Käser. Now we'll pass the mic to Dr. Bajalan. He will be speaking about the contributions of the volume to the discipline of history. Please, Dr. Bajalan, begin.
Well, greetings, everybody, and thank you to the panel for everyone giving great short talks, and also to all the attendees and to all the hard work everybody put into this volume. I think it's an important volume, and I think it's a good contribution to the general literature, not only on Kurdish history, but on the history of the Middle East. Because, of course, one of the deficits that has plagued the study of the history of the Middle East is the exclusion of groups that exist on the periphery of the existing nation states, groups that often lack the institutional and financial backing required in order to execute extensive historical research and extensive projects of this type. The Kurds, of course, are not the only group, but they are perhaps one of the largest groups that have suffered from this problem. So, of course, this affects all disciplines, but I will talk a little bit about the evolution of the study of Kurdish history. Of course, I'm going to have, because this is a short talk, I won't be able to cover everything adequately, so my apologies in advance for anything I miss out that you think is absolutely essential. But what I would say is, to begin with, things in the discipline of history, I think, with regards to the Kurds and the regards to the integration of the story of Kurds and the Kurdish people into the broader story of the Middle East, things are going in a positive direction. But they come, of course, with a pre-existing history behind it, and the history of Kurdish history writing is in itself an interesting process that we need to look at. Now, of course, there is a tendency to focus on Western scholarship on the Kurds, but of course, in the Middle East, there is a tradition of history writing amongst the Kurds. We can look in a kind of proto sense at a work like the Sharafnama, which was written in the 16th century and became for a long time a critical piece of writing on Kurdish history. So much so that in the early 20th century, the intellectual and reformer Abdullah Cevdet noted that it was impossible to defend the Kurdish nation's historical honor with only one book of honor, a play on the words of the name of the Sharafnama, because it played such a central role and there was actually not that much out there. But we see at the beginning of the 20th century in Kurdish newspapers and journals attempts to write in a modern sense a history of the Kurds. And of course, this project continues in the post-Ottoman era and continues in a context in which at the other side, the objectives of the nation states within which the Kurds reside is to deny the Kurds' existence as a distinct cultural or political entity. So a lot of historical writing in the region, at least until recent times, has revolved around the question of whether or not the Kurds exist as a distinct people or a distinct culture. As early as the 1920s, you have the work of Habil Adem, a well-known committer of fraud who used to write books pretending he translated them from German intellectuals, but they're actually his own propaganda, writing basically the official line of the Turkish Republic prior to the establishment of the Turkish Republic, denying that the Kurds exist. And you can see subsequent generations of Turkish nationalist historians have frankly plagiarized his work, not giving him the appropriate citations that he deserves and making interesting adjustments. For example, Habil Adem says that there are only 200 words of Kurdish origin, whereas in later books, which use the same list, they say there are only 200 words of unknown origin. So we see some development in that sense. So we have this long history of Kurdish history writing as an assertion of nationhood vis-a-vis nation states that seek to deny their existence. Of course, in parallel with that, we have the development of Orientalist studies and Orientalist literature on the Kurds. Very often, at the vanguard of this development are practitioners of imperial policy. One of the first important Western scholarship to be written on the Kurds was written by Alexander Jaber, the Polish Orientalist and diplomat who served in the Ottoman Empire at the behest of the Tsarist regime. And of course, if we look at the United Kingdom, we see individuals like C.J. Edmonds playing an important role in early scholarship on the Kurds. Again, another individual who had extensive experience working as a colonial official. And of course, that too has affected the development of the study of Kurdish history, because you have people coming from a more area studies orientated background. So I would add on to this as well. If you were studying history or Middle Eastern history, studying the Kurds was not a great career move for you for much of the 20th century. Why? Well, increasingly governments and states became involved in funding their own scholarship of the particular countries. And also, it was extremely difficult to access the necessary sources you needed to engage in historical studies. If you wanted to study Kurdish history, if you didn't have the appropriate ideological orientation, it was difficult to access important archives such as the Ottoman archives in Istanbul or the National Archives in Ankara or other such collections around the Middle East. So the specter of the political nature of the Kurdish question cast itself long across this issue. Of course, in the second half of the 20th century, there are major improvements in the field. We see important books by Martin van Brundersen, we see books by Dr. Jawada, and even books by non-specialists like David McDowell, which again although he's not strictly an academic, his book proved extremely influential. A lot of these earlier studies were either anthropological or sociological in nature, and of course, nationalism and political science was extremely important. But in recent years, for a variety of different reasons, the increased political power of the Kurdish movement in the region, the accidental liberalization of the Turkish political sphere due to the conflict between the Kemalists and the new Islamist elites, these created opportunities for new generations of scholars to work. And today we see people—
Can you wind up, please?
Sure.
Please.
And we see new generations of scholars moving beyond, the older styles of study, moving beyond even political questions. People like Nilay Ozok Gundoğan, who's working on historical sociology, Zozan Pehlivan, who works on things like environmental history, Janet Klein, who works on Armenian-Kurdish relations. So we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of innovation in the field, and I'm very positive about the future and hopeful that we will continue on this path to develop a broader history, not only of the Kurdish elites, but also of the Kurdish masses.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bajalan. Thank you all for the concise, informative presentations and contributions. It was a pleasure and a privilege to work with you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to moderate this excellent session. Now, we'll pass the mic on to the attendees. There are a lot of questions. Please bear in mind that given the time limitations, we're not going to be able to address each and every question, and nor are we going to be able to do justice to all of the questions that you've raised, but we'll do our utmost, rest assured. So I'll begin with one of the earlier questions, which is for Dr. Ganesh. And Monique is asking, do you deal in the book with the Kurdish Jews as well? If not, why not?
Yeah, no, we don't have a chapter on Kurdistan's Jews. As I mentioned, we would have liked to have more chapters on minoritized groups, and as Professor Bozarslan has mentioned, but on this occasion, we were not able to include that. Thank you.
We have a question on to, Professor Bozaslan by Barış Tuğrul. And it's a long question, but I'll try to summarize it as much as possible. Professor Bozaslan, analyzing the Kurdish question from a general perspective is quite a big deal, as the political trajectory of each nation state, among which Kurds find themselves divided, is different from one another. Bringing similar sort of quantitative and qualitative data together in each of these contexts appear to be a challenging issue. In your opinion, how could we overcome this obstacle and map out a comprehensive generational analysis on Kurds? Thank you very much. Professor Bozarslan?
Yes, I will be very, very brief. I think that what is very important in the study of the generational relations is that we have to take into account simultaneously the transmissions and the discontinuities. That's the case for each part of Kurdistan, but that's the case also concerning different parts of Kurdistan. For instance, the generation of 1960s has quite obviously some shared references to the Barzani movement, for instance. That was not only an Iraqi Kurdish movement, but it has exerted a very important role in the socialization of the generations throughout Kurdistan. I think that we have some landmarks, and these landmarks, they are both generational landmarks and shared trans-border landmarks. But these landmarks does not mean that there is only transmission. There is also discontinuities, and we see that between 1975 and 1978 and 1979, all through Kurdistan, we have generational discontinuities. The emergence of the PKK, the emergence of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the emergence of Komala shows that this generational breakup is experienced everywhere simultaneously for many reasons. So I will stop here, but maybe one last question concerning the Russian sources. The Russian sources are more and more used both in the Iraqi Kurdistan and in Turkey, in Kurdistan of Turkey. Jalil, for instance, has done an incredible work on this. We have now a lot of documents coming from the Russian archives concerning the Barzani movement and the Barzani's exile in the Soviet Union. So we use them more and more, at least those who are able to read Russian.
Thank you, Professor Bozaslan. We have a question from Veli Yadirgi regarding the Kurdish. Does the Kurdish youth movement have a place in the book as well? Dr. Ganesh, would you like to address that question?
Well, not specifically. We don't have a chapter on Kurdish youth movements, but as Professor Bozarsan said, there is it's part of the background analysis and the political developments and how the youth played a role in those developments are kind of covered, broadly speaking. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganesh. There's a question on philology of Iranian languages. So I'm a junior researcher in the linguistics and philology of Iranian/Iranic languages. My question is, in the process of compiling this book and the gathering of scholarship from various fields, what did you feel that was still lacking in the current study of Kurdish linguistics? This would be very helpful for a scholar of Iranian languages to know. Thank you. Professor Bozaslan, would you be able to address kindly that question?
Can you summarize it very briefly, please?
So the question is, in the process of compiling this book and the gathering the scholarship from various fields, what did you feel that was still lacking in the current study of Kurdish linguistics?
I think that Dr. Bajalan has already pointed this question. Actually, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was Memuzin and Sharafname and probably nothing else. I am not an expert in the classical literature, but I know that since 25 years, there are a lot of classical documents that have been uncovered, and poetry, but also mystical literature. This mystical literature has been preserved either in some libraries or in some madrasas. All this has not been built in our book, but I think that some scholars, they are working on that. The Kurdish, we have dealt with the contemporary literature. Hashemzadeh, for instance, has written an article on this issue. But concerning the classical literature, I think that both in the Iraqi Kurdistan, in the Iranian Kurdistan, and the Kurdistan of Turkey, of course, we have a lot of things compared at least to 25 years ago. And we have also quite important reviews. For instance, a review like Nubuhar, whose editors are rather religiously oriented, but they have a very good initiation to the Kurdish classical literature. They publish a lot of documents on this issue.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put the final question, which is from Mark Imperator. The question is, since the fight against Daesh is the Western view of Kurdish women heavily influenced by Rojava, does the KRI benefit from that? Dr. Käser, would you like to touch up on that, or Dr. Hardi?
So the question is the image or the rise of the women fighters. Has it had any advantages for the KRI region? Right.
Yes. So since the fight against Daesh, that's what the attendee is asking us. Is the Western view of Kurdish women heavily influenced by Rojava? And a consecutive question is, does the KRI benefit from that?
Personally, it's been a very good example to counter stereotypes in the classroom. Every time we go over what a woman is, definition of man and woman, we always bring the women of Rojava, the fighters, as a counterexample to expectations. The problem with this, though, generally the public here, whenever you mention the women fighters, they say they are different, they're special. These women are different, it's unique, it's rare. Our women cannot do that. So by sort of portraying it as an unique example, and as women who have different political and social contexts, they try to say that that may be true for them and it works over there, but it wouldn't work here, and our women are not like that. So, one of the things of the system is to have token success or token examples of empowered women. So they see it as that. That does not reflect on the abilities of women in general. In that way, they sort of isolate or stop the discussion about what woman is and how we can redefine what woman is.
Thank you, Dr. Hardi. Dr. Käser, would you like to add anything, or? Okay, thank you all for joining us and for the excellent questions. I am much obliged to all of the panelists for their concise and informative contributions, and it would be highly ungracious of us to not once again thank the Cambridge team for the excellent work they've done for the past 3 years. We're much obliged to you all. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
My thanks to the panelists for a really interesting discussion and the insights into both the volume and the field more generally. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.